Alright, now that we've got that pansy storytelling stuff out of the way, let's get to the real game. Violence. Jokes aside though, combat in Stars of the City is both the main draw of the system and the main drawback of the system. It's a mostly faithful conversion of Library of Ruina's combat, a game with a very unique combat system that's explained incredibly poorly. The system isn't what I'd describe as easy to run, but I've done everything in my power to make sure you can keep up the pace once you understand the basics. To those who understand Ruina's combat already, this should be much easier to comprehend, to the point where I recommend all game masters beat Ruina, or at least get a ways into the endgame. Before we get into the process of running combat, we need to define the basic components. Rounds of combat in this game are called scenes. The start and end of a scene are both important steps in the process and is referred to often, so it's important to remember the term. HP is pretty standard. You lose HP when you get hit, and are knocked out if it reaches 0. HP remains between battles, so make sure you don't get reckless just because a fight's almost over. Stagger resist is more unique to this system. Just like HP, you lose stagger resist when you get hit, or if you are affected by something that says it deals stagger. When stagger resist reaches 0, you are staggered, which means you cannot act and your defenses are ignored, all until the end of the next scene. Unlike HP, you always start each battle with your max stagger resist. Light is a resource used to fuel your skills. You start each battle with max light, and regain 1 or more light at the start of each scene. The more light you have, the bigger the skills you can use. Then we come to speed dice, which define both the number of actions you can take in a scene, and the order you take them in. Sort of like initiative in other systems. Each die has their own value rolled at the start of a scene, and different characters will have different numbers and sizes of speed dice. Finally, we have affinities. When you're hit, the attack that hits you is going to be one of 3 types: blunt, slash, or pierce. You have 6 affinities, 2 for each of these types, and split into damage affinity and stagger affinity. For instance, you can have a pierce damage affinity of -2, but a pierce stagger affinity of +1, meaning that when hit by a pierce attack, you take 2 less damage but 1 more stagger. The same applies for enemies. Getting into the flow of combat, you always start by defining the combatants on the field, then set everyone's stagger resist and light to their maximum. Now, let's start the first scene. Every combatant rolls their speed dice, and you order all of them highest to lowest, with players always breaking ties with enemies. Then, if it's a scene past the first, each combatant regenerates light based on the light regen listed in their sheet, which usually starts at 1. Now, we start actually taking some turns, starting with whoever has the highest speed die. In this case, it would be Ryoshu. On Ryoshu's turn, she wants to attack the abnormality. To do so, she first announces her target. The enemy then decides whether it wants to use one of its own skills in return. In this case, it does. It can choose which of its speed dice to retaliate with, but this will usually be the slowest one for tactical reasons. The enemy now must declare the name of the skill it wants to use, and Ryoshu, now that she has this information, can decide which skill she's actually using. You can and should have an idea of what you want to use beforehand, but you'll figure out the enemy's skill list as combat goes on, and will start being able to adapt based on the skill name declared. Once both skills are decided, spend the light cost of each skill. Then, it's time to clash. Each skill is made up of 1 or more dice. Offensive dice are your attacks, and can be of the 3 types listed previously, while defensive dice keep you safe, either by blocking or evading attacks. In this case, Ryoshu's skill is made up of 2 dice, each of which are 1d8 offensive dice, while the enemy has an offensive dice that's 1d12 plus 4. Clashing takes place when there are two dice opposing each other. Roll the dice and compare the value. In this case, Ryoshu's first die is a total of 6, while the enemy rolls a whopping 10. What occurs after a clash depends on the type of dice, but for offensive dice it's simple. The lower die is destroyed, doing nothing, and the opposing die goes through and deals its damage and stagger. Now, both characters have used their first die, but Ryoshu still has another one to go. Since the enemy only had the one die, this one goes unopposed, rolling a 3. That means that the enemy takes a base damage and stagger of 3, but in this case it has a +2 affinity for slash damage, so it takes a total of 5 damage instead. The clash is over and we move on to the next turn. The abnormality is up and declares its target, Merceau. The enemy still decides on and declares its skill name first, however, so that the players will always have a leg up in this regard. This time, Merceau is using a skill with 1 block die, while the enemy is using 1 offensive die and 1 block die. Merceau completely blocks the first die with a tie, but there's 1 leftover block die on the abnormality's side. Since defensive dice can't be used on their own, they are saved when they have no dice to clash with. When Heathcliff takes his turn, instead of responding to his attack with a skill, the abnormality responds by deploying the saved block die, which doesn't require the use of a speed die. Heathcliff still wins the clash, but the block die reduces the power of the hit. Now, the scene is over. If any attacks inflicted any statuses, many of them would activate their effects or be removed at this stage. Now, start from the top of the next scene. Re-roll speed dice and keep going until one side is defeated. Now, let's go over the different interactions between dice. Offensive dice are easy. If they win the clash or go unopposed, they deal damage and stagger equal to their power, which is the final result of the die. If they lose or tie the clash, they do nothing. Block dice are a defensive die that, if it loses a clash against an offensive die, reduces the opposing die's power by its value. So if you use a block die with 3 power, and your enemy hits you with a 7 power offensive die, you are hit with 4 total power. If you win a clash with a block die, you deal stagger equal to the difference in power. So if we reverse the previous values, you'll end up dealing 4 stagger to the enemy. Evade dice are the most complicated. Against offensive dice, they negate the attack on a win, and, unlike other die, are reused instead of destroyed, so you can keep evading. On a fail against offensive dice, they will instead just reduce the stagger you take when hit. Against defensive dice, on a win, you regain some stagger resist, but you don't get to keep the die, so defensive dice are a way to shut down a strong dodge. There's also counter dice, which you'll start seeing as you get into the mid-game. These are variations of the other dice types, and are only used as deployed dice. When attacked, you can deploy a counter die, and if the die wins, it is reused against the next die on the same opposing skill. No matter the results of the clashes, the counter die is always destroyed when the opposing skill ends. Let's go over a few mechanics that don't fit into the typical flow of combat. The first is holding a speed die. When it's your turn to choose an action, you can instead choose to hold your speed die for later. Then, when an ally is targeted, you can force the enemy to target you instead, using the held speed die to intercept. This way, fast characters can still play somewhat defensively. The next mechanic is emotion points and ego. For most characters, this will only come up starting from level 2. When you clash, regardless of if you win, lose, or tie, you will always gain 1 emotion point. You can also gain some emotion points at the start of combat based on your persona stat. These emotion points are spent to unleash ego, which are powerful effects with a supernatural element. Most mechanics of an ego are covered in the ego's own description, but the one thing you need to know now is ego passives. Once you use an ego, its passive effect will activate for the rest of the battle, and of course, once battle ends, the passive deactivates. Finally, if you go down in combat, you're brought back up to 10 HP and gain some injuries and anxieties based on your level. If everyone goes down, the GM will enforce some kind of narrative consequence. That's all the basics you need to know. Next episode we'll get into the finer details of combat. If there's any aspects of combat that you're confused about, now is a good time to leave a comment below so I can address some common misunderstandings next time. Speaking of next time, I'm going to try and release these episodes every other week or so until I'm done with them. After that, I want to try talking about some of Limbus Company's game design and maybe even story. I've also heard a question or two about maybe setting up a Discord server for people to talk about Stars of the City and find groups to play with. This has been on my radar, but I don't want to end up with a Discord server of like 10 people, so I'm going to try and do this when I have a large enough community. Maybe 1,000 or 2,000 subs or so? Hint hint. Anyways, that's all for this video. Do all that like and subscribe stuff, and I'll see you next time. Bye bye!